So, hello, welcome to the Museum of Printing. Some of you have been here before, some of you maybe are new. So I'm Andy Volpe, and I've been involved with the museum since about 2010, 2011. And my big thing is engraving, intaglio printing. And I got really into the stuff with Paul Revere and his work. And the printing office of Edes and Gill actually got its start at the Museum of Printing in its old location in North Andover around the same time that I started getting involved. So one of the open houses, I saw this guy in colonial attire printing copper plate of Revere's Massacre. And I had been doing living history since about 2002 with the Higgins Armory Museum, which closed in 2013 and moved in with the Worcester Art Museum, and I still give programs wearing arms and armor there. And so, yeah, I saw this guy in colonial gear printing intaglio, and I'm like, I need to know this guy. So I started chatting with him, and we started talking shop, and I was persistent, and we got a good relationship going, and I ended up printing all of the copper plate stuff and engraving copies of Revere's prints as he did them, as engravings. And my thing since starting with him is that we had the cut down version of Paul Revere's Boston Massacre. He had cut down the plate and reused the plate in 1775. So I had always wanted to do a full-scale thing, but I had just started to really get into hand engraving, and I didn't feel my handiwork was that precise yet, let alone having to do everything backwards, which is the problem in printing. In both letterpress and in engraving, everything is backwards. So I'll talk more about that. So in 2020, last year, I completed a full-size, exact same size, hand-engraved copy of Revere's Massacre, exactly the same way that Revere copied Henry Pelham, which I'll again get into. I'm not going to dwell too much on the backstory of the prints and some of the replicas. I'll touch a little bit on it, but I kind of want to focus more on the process and what's going on in the background. So these two images are postcards I engraved for the printing office, showing the two printing presses that are in use in the colonies since 1639. Elizabeth Glover and her husband dies on the ship voyage over. She hires a man by the name of Samuel Day to print. He's actually a locksmith by trade. So they set up the first printing press in the English colonies in 1639 in Cambridge with what we call today a common press. So that's the one here on the right, left. Everything's backwards. With the printing press similar to this that we're all familiar with, the pull bar and things like that. We don't see a rolling press, which is what you see here on the right, which you need for printing engravings, for intaglio prints, etchings, engravings, mezzotints, things like that. You cannot print it on a letterpress. You have to print it on a rolling press. We don't see this kind of a press show up until about the 1690s. Explain a little bit about the two differences, what's going on. Letterpress printing is what we call relief printing. So everything that's going to print is on the surface. That's inked, and that's what the paper is pressed onto, and that makes your print. Everything that's not going to print is carved away, or the surface is reduced down so it won't hold ink when you ink it. You have what are called ink balls, these cups with a handle on it where you stuff it with wool and put a leather covering on it, and you dab ink. You actually beat ink onto the lead type. You then use this Timpan and Frisket, these two devices here on the side, and these will hold the paper above the type. You close everything down on top of the type here that's inked. You then roll it into the press and pull the pull bar, and you have to do that twice. For the presses at this point only have enough power to print one half of the form at a time. It's not until after independence, and the whole museum starts basically at American independence with presses that have the entire platen, the entire printing area that's cast in iron, and you can do one whole page all at once with one pull. This lockup here in the middle is the Declaration of Independence that's printed in Boston, and this is replicated by the printing office of Edes and Gill in Boston at Faneuil Hall, and this is what we print almost exclusively on our letterpress. So if you're a compositor, or later known as a typesetter, you're grabbing individual pieces of letters out of each of these boxes to compose your words, compose your document. And this goes all the way back to Gutenberg, all the way back to the 1440s. So your case on the upper part of the composing table holds all your capital letters. All your little letters are held in the lower case. And that is literally where upper and lower case comes from. And if you look really carefully, The P and the Q box in the 18th century are right next to each other. So mind your P's and Q's. So this is what you can do with letterpress. You're printing words. Gutenberg is printing copies of the Bible, things like that. So the Declaration of Independence, as I mentioned, in Boston, this is what it looks like when it's printed in Boston. It's in columns because Edes and Gill, who print this, are printing newspapers, so they're used to printing things in columns. So they're using the information from Philadelphia, from Dunlop's broadside, which is one large paragraph, what we call an essay style, and they convert it into type with what they're familiar with. Over here is, this is in the museum's collection. This is a leaf from the Algonquin Bible from the 1640s, printed by Stephen Day. Later John the Printer and John Eliot. John the Printer was a Native American, an Algonquin, who was an apprentice under John. And you can do images in woodcuts or metal cuts using the same printer's type, metal type that the letters are made out of. However, the imagery, consistency, and the color, the ink coverage and the quality of the line is kind of up to debate, especially in the colonies, because you're not just a specialist in one particular area. You have to kind of specialize in several different skills, because the ships that are importing everything that you have to buy in England is a 2-month voyage. So sometimes you just have to make do with what you have, with the skills you have. This piece here is done by Paul Revere for the Boston Gazette by Edes and Gill, which happens to print this. Cut as a relief, so this is going to print in with the letterpress movable type. And this cut here of a little lady from 1770 out of Boston, I'm not sure if it's out of wood or out of metal. It's quite confusing to figure out what's what. But you can see the quality isn't that great. Oddly enough, though, even centuries earlier than this, woodcuts had a very good amount of skill put into them, especially in Germany in the 1570s. The woodcuts are incredibly detailed and intricate. But in England, by the 1640s, the quality could be really cheap, and that just goes right over in the colonies. So engraving is the other half of the printing, and as I mentioned, you have to have a separate printing machine to print these. You got one guy who's inking the plate, you have another guy who's wiping the plate clean because you have to wipe the surface, and then you got a guy wrenching it through with hands and feet on that star wheel with those rollers. And this is an example of one of my own works of a ferruginous hawk in engraving. So this is the exact opposite of letterpress printing. So instead of printing on the surface, you're printing inside the copper plate. So you take an engraving tool called a burin and you carve lines into the copper plate that holds the ink. You then cover the whole thing black and then carefully wipe off the surface, leaving the ink inside those lines. This is a pretty refined process, and it's a much slower process than letterpress. But you get a fantastic line quality, like these two images from Diderot's Encyclopedia. Again. But the use of these, copper plates for illustrating books and manuscripts is extremely labor-intensive, slower printing process, and very expensive. So especially in the colonies, it's just not that commonly used. But you do have things like single sheet papers and prints that do show up. And one of the first things that we have printed in the colony on engraving is paper currency, paper money. And this is done by John Foster in 1690. And you can even see here the earlier seal. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. To mention too, one of the problems that we have with being a colonist is that, like I said, you got a two-month boat ride if you're going across, or if you're buying anything that has to be shipped over. So almost immediately in the 1630s, England starts to pass importation taxes and restrictions. You cannot make anything in the colonies. You have to buy it in England and have it shipped over because, well, we don't want to take work away from people in England. Ironically, the charters for these colonies like Jamestown, Maryland, and Massachusetts Bay, they're venture capitals. So they're there to make money. So we see several taxes and trade laws passed in as early as 1690, all the way up into 1765. And that's the one that we often talk about with the Stamp Act, because that introduces a stamp, and here's the stamp. So if you're a printer in the colony, you have to buy the press and the type and have it shipped over to you from England. You have to buy the paper from the Netherlands or from England and have it shipped over. before you can sell it, after you've spent a week printing your newspaper, you have to have a stamp by a stamp collector. You have to pay for each stamp. He has to affix that stamp to each sheet of paper to make it legal to be purchased. And then, in order to recoup that tax, you have to then pass it on to your customers who are paying a weekly subscription for their weekly paper. So right away, it's hitting the printers, really. And it's not just newspapers. It's like a 15% tax on your newspaper. It's playing cards, it's legal bills of sale, and it's legal certificates. So if you're a printer printing legal documents, and why 1765? Well, that's right after the French and Indian, or the 7 Years' War, some people call it. And it was a massive war debt, especially in Massachusetts Bay. So they're like, we're just going to hit the printers. Keep in mind, too, that in 1775, there were 15 print shops in Boston for a population of about 15,000 people. Philadelphia, with a population of about 50,000 people, has 2 print shops. So you want to hit the cash cow, you hit the printers. And of course, they were not happy about that. So you see things like skulls and crossbones placed on the bottom corner of the paper of where you're going to affix the stamp as a message, not very subtle, to the tax collector. You put the stamp on here, you're killing me, you're killing my business. So this is a big thing. Other silversmiths and goldsmiths, even as far back as the 1450s, are using the same tools in goldsmithing and jewelry and applying it to flat copper plates and printing off of those plates. Nathaniel Hurd Mulligan is a clockmaker in Newburyport. He's using the same tools as Paul Revere is using. Amos Doolittle is an engraver in Connecticut. He's called the Revere of Connecticut. He later does four prints from eyewitness accounts from the battles of Lexington and Concord. And Revere himself actually gets commissioned by Massachusetts to print what he calls the sword hand shilling, or the soldier's note, in 1775. He also does this North Battery certificate. We consider this his first copperplate engraving in 1762. And you notice it says Majesty. So 1762, everything's all hunky-dory with Parliament and the King. He's also very active as a Mason, so of course we've got Masonic certificates and things. He also does trade cards, and this is popular both in England and in the colonies. So if you're a business, you want to detail all of your services and your goods, you have somebody like Revere engrave a really fancy trade card. So it's not only an advertisement of you, the service person, but also as the engraver. We also have some metal cuts or wood cuts, and again, I'm not going to try to dwell into the complications of the term. We see them mentioned as just cuts or metal cuts. So he's probably using the same lead type cast into a block, and he's cutting these out for newspapers because he can lock this all into a press and print it all at once. You don't have to do a separate process with engraving and then bind it into a book or something like that. Then, of course, Revere gets into political imagery, and he is not subtle. This Warm Place Hell from 1768, remember I said 65 as a stamp tax, so in 68, only a few years later, Revere also does a silver bowl, punch bowl, about the rescinders. This is in the MFA in Boston. Later on in 1774, he does copies of English prints, because you can put a magazine and a newspaper onto a ship and send it over to the colony. If you're a printer, you can take the information, the stories, and the images, and just copy it in-house, and then print your own version of your own magazine in the colony. So this happens to be the Able Doctor, or America swallowing the bitter draft. And she's being force-fed tea that they're being taxed on. Again, he's not subtle. And one of my favorites is the landing of the troops. So this happens in 1768. Around September, 12 ships of war show up in Boston Harbor. Their cannons are loaded. They're ready for an all-out, full-scale war against the colonists. They land 2 regiments of troops, one of them being the 29th Regiment of Foot, which comes into play with the Boston Massacre. And they march, as Revere calls it, with insolent parade, with fifes and drums playing, all the way up to the State House to occupy the city by force. But things have gotten kind of quiet, after 2 months while the ships are en route. So the colonists look at this and like, well, what's going on, guys? What are you doing here? It's like, oh, we're here to suppress rebellion. What rebellion? There's nothing going on here. But there's no barracks in Boston, so they end up housing soldiers in people's homes. So now you've got crown soldiers in your house, and if you're a member of the Sons of Liberty, that could be really problematic. And of course, again, Revere with this vitriol. To the Earl of Hillsborough, His Majesty's Secretary of State for America, this view of the only well-planned expedition formed for supporting the dignity of Britain and chastising the insolence of America is humbly inscribed. And if you look carefully, here's a native standing on top of a soldier with a mitre cap with 29 as a representation of the 20th Regiment. And I know it's really difficult to see in this image, but these guys are all depicted wearing mitre caps. This is not what we see in the Boston Massacre. So the historical accuracy of who ends up being Henry Pelham's first print is not reflective of what the soldiers were wearing on that night, but that is quite up to a lot of debate right now as to what they were wearing, when, and why. So speaking of the Boston Massacre, the first image that we see is done by a man by the name of Henry Pelham, who's related to John Singleton Copley, a very prominent portrait artist in Boston. And then he intends to publish this in the papers for sale, but by March 26 of 1770, he sees his image with Paul Revere's name on it advertised for sale by Edes and Gill in Boston. There's even a letter that survives from Pelham to Revere saying basically, how dare you? Shaking fist sort of a thing. We have no response from Revere that is known to survive, if he even responded at all. We don't even know if Pelham actually sent it to Revere. We think Pelham is able to recoup his losses by publishing his print anyway, and he apparently recoups enough sales that he drops the issue. But if you look really carefully, you can see there's a lot of similarities. Right down to the badly proportioned State House. These two glaringly circular oculus windows here are a bit off. There's some quirky details. The line quality is really kind of shaky. This might have been like an developmental proof that Pelham printed. We just don't know. So Revere copies Pelham. He adds Butcher's Hall above the troops. Again, his vitriol is showing. He puts his name on it. He changes the title, and he changes the verse. Pelham calls his The Fruits of Arbitrary Power, or The Bloody Massacre. Revere calls his The Bloody Massacre is perpetrated in King Street by the 29th Regiment of Foot. Another thing I didn't mention in the earlier program, but if you take a look on both prints, right here, right above Preston's sword, is a musket hanging out of a window. According to the eyewitness reports, somebody claimed that they heard a shot coming from the customs house. I call it the grassy knoll shooter, because it's never been confirmed if there was another mysterious shooter from the customs house or not. And of course, the vitriol comes into play with this verse. Unhappy Boston, see thy sons deplore, thy hallowed walks be smeared with guiltless gore, while faithless Preston and his savage bands with murderous rancor stretch their bloody hands. Like fierce barbarians grinning over their prey, approve the carnage and enjoy the day. If scalding drops from rage from anguish wrung, if speechless sorrows laboring for a tongue, or if a weeping world can aught appease, the plaintive ghosts of victims such as these. The patriots' copious tears for each are shed, a glorious tribute which embalms the dead. Starting to wax Shakespeare or the Moody Blues or something. But no fate summons to that awful goal where justice strips a murderer of his soul. Should venal courts, the scandal of the land, snatch the relentless villain from her hand. And I love this part. Keen execrations on this plate inscribed shall reach a judge who never can be bribed. So you notice too, the courts in Preston, I put these parentheses in there. Because in his plate, he has them hyphened. And I think that's because you don't want to be naming people in your very horrendous plate about this incident because, they could come back to haunt you, especially during the trial. So he hides, quote unquote, the name of Preston, referring to Captain Preston of the 29th. He also hides courts because he knows this is going to go to trial. And, this could come back to haunt him if he's not careful. He's actually tasked with drawing a diagram of the Boston Massacre as it happened, and this image is not at all what happened. There are claims that Preston stood in front of his troops who were in a semicircle. They were not lined up as in a battle line. But of course, everything is taking off of Henry Pelham's work. So Pelham is the one who's not accurate. But he also makes this horrendously violent scene. Revere just copies it whole face and gets to the presses before Pelham does. And then paintings of this usually have lots of blood involved, just to make sure the point is made that this was not cool. Mulligan, that clockmaker I mentioned in Newell Report, copies Paul Revere. But he's copying Henry Pelham in the end. But he happens to include Butcher's Hall, and he has the same title, but he changes the signature to be Mulligan. So, again, copying. We have no idea if Revere was angry or not. We don't think he even really cared. He got enough prints sold or whatever. Bingley in London happens to have images of both Pelham and Revere and combines them. He's got Butcher's Hall, but he's got some of the details, the skulls and crossbone and the broken sword of justice from Pelham's work. The backstory in this is really mysterious. I haven't dug that deeply into it. But it's a print that survives. And then this image, as we see, is copied, all from Revere's copy of Pelham. Woodcuts for newspapers, other engravings. Then we see in 1832, Stratton, an engraver in Boston, does an exact replica engraving, hand-engraved, of Revere's Massacre. And it's not until 2013 that we see another hand-engraved copy done by Colonial Williamsburg, as far as I can tell. And in my print, which I'll talk about in a minute, is one of the only hand-engraved replicas other than Colonial Williamsburg that exists. You can get some Stratton originals, but mine's going to be a lot less expensive. And Colonial Williamsburg only printed a couple of these. I don't even know how available this is at all. Right? And apparently the master engraver said that they would never do this again because it was so complicated. So like, okay, that's some warning about that. Then, of course, 1850s, we're starting to see the abolitionist movement take a hold, and Champney does this lithograph. So if you notice, there's no depictions of Crispus Attucks that's discernible in any of the images. He's mentioned by name, but he's not depicted by Pelham. Revere copies Pelham, and he doesn't make any depictions of Attucks, but he mentions them in the verse. There's a Philadelphia Paul Revere colored one, and this fellow here has a brown face. So there are some images that exist, even original Reveres, that firmly depict Attucks. But by 1850, they decide to put him front and center, quite literally. And that changes the narrative of not only the Massacre, but also the abolitionist movement. Bob Tomolilio, he did this print in last year, and he took Champney's lithograph of Attucks and put them in Revere's version as an updated version. The accuracy, again, I'm not going to get into arguments about the accuracy of the scene. The violence of the scene, the message in the propaganda is the real message of this print. I have been tempted to do an updated, accurate, according to the court trials and things like that, depiction of the massacre, but that's this plate took me upwards of 60 hours of work just engraving it. So it's a lot to think about. What happens to the plate? So as you notice, the bottom is cut off. So Revere reuses the back of the plate for paper money. So this is what's back on the back of the plate. According to the story, and I haven't been able to confirm this or not, somewhere in the 1840s or 50s, somebody was in the Massachusetts archives and they come across a plate of banknotes and they turn it over and they realize they have the Boston Massacre plate. Not sure if that's true or not. Not sure when. It doesn't matter. We have the plate. It exists. It's in the Commonwealth Museum. It's in the state archives. In 1970, the Imprint Society got special permission by the state to get the plate. They had it steel-faced with an electrical process, and they had a firm in New York hand print a special edition. And some of these are still available out there on the internet. And this is, for all intents and purposes, a print from the actual plate. They unsteel-faced it and then put it in the archives, and that's what you see there. So if you look at the bottom, you can just barely see the tops of the letters from that verse. So this is how the plate looks now. So then I decided to take on the project of bringing the plate back, the image back to what it looked originally, instead of just going to an inkjet printer in a PDF from like the American Antiquarian Society. I wanted something more tangible. So one of the things I had to do is research and figure out, well, how the heck do you actually do transfers? And I have a book from the 1430s talking about making tracing paper and how to do transfers. And then the 1640s and 1700s, we have books that come out, manuals on printing and engraving, showing you how to do transfers with your drawing. You take beeswax, melt it onto your copper plate that's all polished, and then transfer the image on there. So this one over here, The Art of Graving, is a William Faithorn. He's an Englishman, and he translates Abraham Boss, who's a French printer from 1645, and prints his in 1702. And so that's that little verse there, talking about taking virgin wax and melting it on there. Earlier, Polygraphicae from Salmon in 1673 has an almost identical description of how to do this. So this is how they did it. This is what I'm pretty sure Paul Revere did. Whether he had a print or he had a drawing, don't know, don't care. I had to go about the way that I could figure out. So a neighbor of mine at the studios that I rent a studio down in Whitensville, Massachusetts, or Northbridge, Al Weems, he's a photographer, and he has a large inkjet printer, so he can print larger than 8.5 by 11, which I could only do on my cheap printer back then. So I gave him a full-size, what I thought was a full-size proportional scan PDF file from the Antiquarian Society, and this is also out of Clarence Brigham, who was a curator at the AAS in the 1950s. And this book, Paul Revere's Engravings, is a fantastic book about all of the engravings that they had. So I took the image, scaled it up as best I thought, had them printed out. We actually had to print it out 3 times because it came out all wonky. I did a tracing of it, and then I got a hold of the restrike, and then I found out, much to my horror, nothing lined up. So I basically had to start all over again. But I had the restrike, so I knew that that was from the actual plate. So I knew the proportions on the image were going to be perfect. Now it was just a matter of lining up the text, which I can barely write Dr. Scratch, and I trained originally in high school as a drafter, doing all capitals. So having to do the scroll work that Revere has been famous for, and doing it backwards on copper plate, and trying to fit it into those little tiny margins, kept me up at night, sweating cold sweat. But here is the wax transfer on the copper plate from 2 different angles. Here are the troops. And you can just see the scratches. So once you transfer it onto wax, the wax onto the copper, you then have to scratch your guidelines, following all those pencil lines on the wax, because you wipe away the wax, because there'll be a giant smudge if you're not careful. So you have to scratch it onto the copper. So here's some of the developmental work. I started from the top and worked my way down. The buildings were easy because those are straight lines. But then as I got to the curves and the people, and I can't draw people very well to begin with, let alone engrave them. But thankfully, again, I had the wax transfers of the original print, so that helped quite a bit. And this is by like the end of February, and I'm getting close to March. It's like I need to finish this thing. But each day, full day's work of engraving this, I'm starting to see this image appear before my eyes, and I'm like, this is happening. I'm doing this. It looks just like the image. Everything is matching up. This is great. Then of course I had to do the text, and that was a nightmare. And this is one of the first proofs when I had quote unquote everything done except for my signature at the bottom, and then I got to debut the print and the plate. And the first place I got to see it was the Worcester Art Museum, and they had an exhibit that was done by the Antiquarian Society, both between the Worcester Art Museum and the Concord Museum. They both had incredible pieces in the collection, original things, original Revere stuff. It was a fantastic exhibit. So here is my plate. So not only is this a hand-engraved copy of Revere, exactly the way Revere did it, it's hand-colored, copying the American Antiquarian Society's original colored version. And then later on, I started doing it with Gary's request, started painting Crispus Attucks there from that Philadelphia print, and that's what's available. Here I am with Helmut, Higgins' mascot, wearing armor. He didn't say anything about the print. That's okay. And here's my setup here. I've got this portable printing press at my studio, and I can take it places. I had a little certificate based on Revere's North Battery certificate for kids to come up, or actually anybody. If they wanted to print it, it takes about 10 minutes. I'm going to take 10 minutes of your time. Ink it. I'll ink it or wipe it. You roll it through the press, you end up with this print, and when it's dry, it's got little spaces in there saying, whoever printed this at the Worcester Art Museum on this date. You could fill in all that stuff. I had kids all over that. They absolutely loved it. So I was hoping to do other programs at the museum. Of course, last year was a completely different story, but hopefully things will start to rekindle in the next couple of years. And of course, the Revere exhibit at the Art Museum had the original prints. So here's Pelham's right next to Paul Revere's. And that was great to see those two right next to each other. And at least one of the Pelhams was colored like this. So that's what I used as my special edition for the Museum of Printing here that are available for sale. Sorry, Sam Adams from the Royal American Magazine. This was printed by Isaiah Thomas, and this is 1774. So if you know your history about the Revolutionary War and how things started to unfold rather quickly, he's calling it the Royal American Magazine. He moves to Worcester not long after he starts this magazine. He could be arrested for printing treason and sedition. So he takes his printing press down to a component level to a pile of wood, puts it on a boat, and goes down the Charles River, literally underneath British eyes, on his way to Worcester, and sets up with Timothy Bigelow, who's a blacksmith in Worcester, and they print in his basement, in Bigelow's basement. And he's back in action with this Worcester spy. And he's actually one of the first ones to print an eyewitness account of Lexington and Concord, which happens the next year in 75. Also in 74, with Worcester, in the fall, several thousand militiamen show up in response to the Massachusetts Act, which removed the local vote for courts and magistrates, for judges and magistrates. Those were all appointed only by Parliament. So you get a commission by Parliament, again, 2-month voyage on a ship, so you get a special piece of paper that says, you're the boss, you're the court of the Shire of Massachusetts, which is Worcester, to hold court. It's no longer the vote by the local populace. So in response to that, several thousand militiamen from far away as Hadley, Massachusetts, in Western Mass, show up, and they keep the courts closed. They will not allow the judges to conduct legal proceedings. One of them is Timothy Payne. And they have to march down Main Street with their hats in their hands and apologize to the colonists for their commissions, for daring to take a parliamentary commission over and over and over again until they're basically shown the door from town. And from Worcester west is no longer under British authority. So, and that's 74. So you can imagine what that means only a year later. Not even a year later. So then they decide to go after the powder stores and Lexington, Concord, and we all know how that ended up. And the Concord Museum had, like I said, they had their own significant pieces on display. They had this restrike from 1850, and they happen to have a promissory note, which is on the back of that plate, which I thought that was really nice to have that. And they happen to have the Stratton plate from 1832, so I thought that was really nice. And then we are in Boston in March 7th, 2020, on the 250th anniversary. So here we are at the printing office of Edes and Gill in Faneuil Hall, printing it exactly the same way Paul Revere printed it, using the same ink, same paper, same press, same process. 250 years later. That was really fun. This press up here in the window is Gary's original 1740s all-wooden press. There's only 4 of these that exist in the world. This is the only one in the Western Hemisphere. We have an exact copy of that made, so that's what we print on. Then the Virginia Rare Book School made a replica wooden press using Diderot's encyclopedia schematics. So we're not the only ones with a fully functional replica wooden press, but we're the ones that have the only original 1740s wooden press. So we like to have some friendly competition with the Rare Book School in Colonial Williamsburg, though much to their credit, we would not exist without the Colonial Williamsburg printers. They have helped us immensely getting Gary off the ground and doing his printing stuff. So there's Tyler pulling off one of the prints. He was the printer and I was the inker and wiper. You can see how filthy your hands get really quickly. Down to my elbows was black, and it took me like an hour to scrub that off. And there's Gary in the background. So there he is with my plate. So as I mentioned, my hands are covered in ink. I could not move from that little spot because I was putting ink smudges on everything in the shop. So Gary's looking at this and he's probably wiping off some loose ink. He's told me, he's like, don't touch anything. So I stand there the whole day. It was kind of funny. And here's this little composite of the plate the black and white version, and then I spliced in the colored version. So, like I said, Gary, when he first started, he didn't know any engravers. I was just starting to do my own hand engraving and hand coloring of prints, because I'm a big fan of the old masters. We're talking like 15th, 16th century, 17th century printers, like Albert Dürer, Rembrandt. I was getting big into their stuff. I did a painting of one of the prints as a test, as a litmus test, and he said, okay, that's cool, you can do those. And I said, no, wait, I can do more. And he actually gave me one of the spare plates. It was done as a Photoetch by the Edinburgh printmakers. And I took my engraving tools, and you can see here on the original, the image quality isn't that great. And then I sharpened it up, almost literally. And then I've been doing that for years. Printed hundreds of these, painted hundreds of them. And now we've got a full-size Boston Massacre. Landing of the Troops. Now, I also should point out that if you look, it looks like it's cut off from the one I showed earlier. That's because Revere reused this plate as well for the sword and hand shilling. Gentleman's Magazine in August of 1775 publishes their magazine, and they have a map included, a new and correct plan of the town of Boston. So this is what Boston looked like before all the fill-in in the 1830s, all the Back Bay stuff. And up on the top here, it says Charlestown in ruins. So this is right after the Battle of Bunker Hill. And some of these were colored. And so I took this from the Leventhal map collection at the Boston Public Library, North Battery Certificate. So this ended up being like one of the tests leading up to the massacre, though I didn't know it at the time, because the scroll work for Revere is just so nice, and I had to try to copy that. I don't think it's terribly successful, and one of my shortest lived prints, and I decided to do a print of the house, as it might have looked in 1770, using my own photographs, and then the next year the museum, the print shop moved to Faneuil Hall. So I only printed a couple of these, and I did a copy, or attempted to do a copy of the sword and hand shilling, but I wanted to show both sides. This is actually the front of the bill. And this being Revere, he puts in this symbology. He's got a soldier, as I mentioned, Magna Carta, and of course he later changes it Independence. And this influences a metal cut for a masthead, the top of a newspaper of the Independent Chronicle, interesting name, in 1782. And then they change it to something we're more familiar with in 1788. Now, I'm going to be a little soapboxy here for half a second. There's some questions now about the state seal and whether they're going to revise it or not, or change it. They claim that this is the sword of Miles Standish. I say BS, because this is Paul Revere's hand turned 90 degrees. This is where I think the image comes from. The quote in Latin, "By the sword we seek peace under quiet liberty," is attributed to Lord Algernon in the 1600s. And yeah, that might relate to King Philip's War, but in the 1880s, when the seal is redesigned, that we all know today, the guy who designed it claimed that this was the sword of Miles Standish, and it's convenient because in the 1880s, of course, we have the Plains Indian Wars. But again, I'm not going to get into a soapbox about it because I know it's controversial. Either way, a sword in the hand like this is a very common heraldic device. I did a copy of John Hancock that Paul Revere did from Royal American Magazine. If you remember the Landing of the Troops, here's a 20th Regiment soldier in a mitre cap holding a snake being crushed by, instead of a native, we have Lady Liberty with a Liberty cap. And here's just some quick examples of some of the development work I did for those postcards, and I also with the Salem Train Band, which does 1630s Salem militia from Massachusetts Bay Colony, some postcards I did for that. And those are the two images. So this is the Museum of Printing Special Edition, hand-colored, hand-printed to hand-colored, next to the one that I've done for the printing office based on the Antiquarian Society. And that is my program. And I thank you all for listening.